Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, August 11th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Vice President Kamala Harris in a brand new YouGov A-rated pollster showing North Carolina in a tie against Donald Trump in a state that he won in both 2016 and in 2020. Now, North Carolina has been at the forefront of many of the campaign stops that Kamala Harris was doing prior to Joe Biden dropping out of the race. She had been visiting many cities within the state and had been focusing on it in a way that really went to show that the Biden campaign initially was looking to North Carolina as one of their only opportunities for pickups this election cycle. But since she has become the Democratic nominee, the chances at winning North Carolina have gone up tremendously, now reaffirmed by this poll that shows Kamala Harris doing quite well in a state that Republicans had won in both previous elections. Now, North Carolina is a very unique state in that Democrats have come so close and yet have been so far from winning any statewide race here besides the governorship for quite some time. The last time the Democrats won North Carolina was in 2008 when Barack Obama won the state by 14,000 votes, a margin of victory of 0.33%. Indiana, in fact, a state that Donald Trump went on to win in 2016 by nearly 20 points, went to Obama by a larger margin, both by raw vote share and actual result, than the state of North Carolina in 2008, to give context as to how North Carolina has historically been a very conservative state. And prior to the Trump era, North Carolina had actually been even stronger for Republicans, with the exception of 2008. George W. Bush won North Carolina by 13 points, in 2004 won it by 12 points, and Mitt Romney even won the state by 2 points despite Obama winning it in the election prior. But then Donald Trump came in 2016 and actually did quite well. And from then on, Democrats were thinking North Carolina might be out of reach in a future election because Donald Trump was expanding. But this seems to have been a one-and-done election because by the time the 2020 election came around, Donald Trump only won the state by 1.3%. And many of its counties, especially the populous ones with very big suburban populations and minority populations, shifted to the left relative to 2016. And it looks like, based on the 2022 midterm election results, the state is coming to a point where it could genuinely be won by Vice President Harris. And again, there's reason to believe she might be able to do so. Back in 2022, I referenced this election because I found it to be very fascinating watching North Carolina as a state where the National Democratic Party actually did not invest as much money as you might expect in the state. Given that Democrats were largely playing defense in many of these battleground states, they weren't really focused on North Carolina. Sherry Beasley didn't receive the same amount of funding that you saw John Fetterman receive, or you saw even Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin receive. It was largely a defense campaign and very few offensive opportunities. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania were at the forefront of that, and beyond that, there wasn't that much money that seemed to have gone around beyond those two states. And on top of the fact, Democrats didn't really see North Carolina as a winnable state. The polls had indicated that North Carolina was going to go to Ted Budd, a representative who had been endorsed by Donald Trump, a lesser-known representative, but a largely unproblematic one. He wasn't someone who came into this with a January 6th record or someone who came into this with a very public election denialist record. This was a random congressman who initially polled at 5% in the initial GOP primary polls in the state that Donald Trump handpicked to win this Senate race. And by the time the election came around, according to Real Clear Politics, he was up by 7 points. FiveThirtyEight had a bit more of a tame result here with Ted Budd ahead by 4 points. The reality was he ended up winning by roughly 3 points. And so Ted Budd defeating Sherry Beasley, sure, was a victory for the Republican Party regardless, but it wasn't one that was all too impressive. Given what we saw on the statewide House vote, given what we saw in many of the other elections across the state, on top of just the national average vote in the generic ballot, North Carolina wasn't particularly impressive for Republicans. And so I'm not really shocked today that Kamala Harris is now making North Carolina a state that is back in play for the Democratic Party. When you take a look at how it was polling under Joe Biden, it really wasn't doing well whatsoever. Donald Trump was up 6 points across the state when Joe Biden decided to leave the race and endorse Vice President Harris. And the fact is, she is narrowing up this race no matter what way you're looking at it. And so Kamala Harris within the state has also seen exactly what we've seen on the national level in terms of favorability. People are starting to like her more than they used to. People are starting to respect her more than they used to. People are starting to take her more seriously than they used to. And that's all good news for Vice President Harris, because it puts her in a position where now voters are taking her as seriously as they did Joe Biden, as seriously as they did Barack Obama, as seriously as they did many other Democrats. And while that may not be enough to win the state, and I don't believe right now, if we were to hold the election, that Kamala Harris wins North Carolina, it absolutely goes to show that she is a formidable candidate in this state that otherwise would have been long gone for Democrats had Joe Biden remained the nominee. Now, there's one factor that I haven't mentioned that is really important in North Carolina. The fact that they hold their governor elections in presidential election years seems to be one of the most important factors this election cycle. After Kamala Harris decided that she wasn't going to pursue a vet with Governor Roy Cooper after he publicly withdrew his name from the Veep stakes, a lot of questions had circulated. What would be the reason that North Carolina would vote blue if it was to vote blue, especially given that even Joe Biden couldn't win it back in 2020? And all signs seem to point to this super, super important governor race that has become more mainstream than practically any other down-ballot race across the nation in a state like North Carolina, a swing state. And it is because this North Carolina governor race is probably one of the most insane ones we have seen in a very long period of time, and probably will be very beneficial for the Democratic Party, not only on the presidential level, but also up and down the ballot. North Carolina's governor race, as I mentioned, is currently being held by Lieutenant Governor in a race between Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. He's the Republican incumbent, won his election back in 2020, has been serving in this position for quite some time, against the elected Attorney General Josh Stein, also elected back in 2020. And this governor's race is at a unique point because Mark Robinson is one of the most extreme Republican nominees we have seen on the national level or in the statewide level in any battleground state of this election cycle, without a doubt. Mark Robinson has a lot of scandals to his name, a record of a lot of isms and a lot of discrimination and comments that just simply could not have been made by someone who, in any circumstance, would be perceived as electable. And so Mark Robinson has seen that as many of these scandals have come to light, as many people have started to research Mark Robinson, know more about him, his numbers have gotten far worse. Public policy polling has him at down 6 points. The most recent Carolina Journal poll has him down 5 points. And this most recent poll today that shows Kamala Harris tied with Donald Trump shows him down 10 points across the state. And while I don't believe that Mark Robinson will lose the governor's race by 10 points, just given that North Carolina is a partisan state, at the end of the day, it is clear that when Mark Robinson is doing bad, so does Donald Trump. When these Republicans down the ballot see very negative numbers, the Republicans on the top of the ballot, people like Donald Trump and other candidates in House races and other state legislative races, tend to see a dip in overall support because voters aren't as enthusiastic to get out for the candidate at the top of the ticket, nor anyone down the ticket. And so that is really what has become a major problem for the Republican Party in the past two cycles, the 2018 midterms and the 2022 midterms, not to mention, of course, the 2020 presidential, where they lost the race there, lost the House, lost the Senate. In totality, Donald Trump's image and who he has endorsed, who he has campaigned alongside, who he has propped up to be in these positions in these battleground states very often have skeletons in the closet that end up being very unelectable positions, end up being scandals that could have been easily prevented, but because Donald Trump has endorsed and selected these candidates, they end up making it through a primary only to lose the general election. And so Kamala Harris, if she is to win North Carolina, would be heavily relying on the fact that Josh Stein would be turning out voters on the Democratic side to not only vote for Josh Stein, but rather against Mark Robinson and the ideas that he believes in. Mark Robinson, again, as an extremist candidate, is not somebody who can win in North Carolina in a way that Donald Trump even was able to back in 2016, and certainly not able to do what Mitt Romney did back in 2012. North Carolina is a competitive state, but has elected Democratic governors in both 2016 and 2020 for the sole reason that the Republican opponents just simply weren't good enough. North Carolina is not opposed to electing a Democrat, but on the presidential level, it becomes very difficult. But if it was to happen this cycle, it would be largely because of this governor's election. Now, Kamala Harris has her own skill set that absolutely could build a perfect storm that would be necessary to win in North Carolina. It's a state, again, that Trump won by 1 point back in 2020, and Kamala Harris does, in fact, put the Sun Belt back in play. This is an article from Axios that was printed a week ago, and it is entirely correct. Kamala Harris's campaign strategy can now be expanded further than Joe Biden's appeal to just the white working class. Joe Biden's appeal to voters in the suburban areas of Detroit and Philadelphia and Milwaukee to flip or maintain the blue wall in order to win the Electoral College. Kamala Harris now has a more expansive Electoral College opportunity because of the fact she's more popular in those battleground states, because of the fact that her regional advantage in the southwestern region of the United States provides her increased insight and electability factors in states like Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and locks down some of those states that might be wavering back and forth between Trump and Biden that are now solidly for Kamala Harris. She comes into this with a very unique perspective and a very unique opportunity to take a state like North Carolina and make it far more competitive than what Joe Biden was able to do. And the early indicators, and I get it, we are still 3 months out from the presidential election, but the early indicators suggest she is doing exactly that. And that's why polls like this and news like this absolutely matters and can change the way that this presidential race is viewed. And in a way, I also believe that the Donald Trump campaign is very cognizant that North Carolina might become far more competitive than what they had hoped for. In the 2024 cycle, a lot of the conversation that they had been talking about was that North Carolina was never going to go to Joe Biden, that on the national level, Donald Trump was leading in a way that Joe Biden just couldn't, and it wasn't about maintaining the states that Trump had won. It was a given that he was going to win every state he had won in the 2020 election, but that he was expanding not only to his 2016 map, but potentially further. You had people like Chris LaSavita, some of Trump's closest advisors, very publicly say that Donald Trump is on track for victory, and there wasn't really much that was going to change that until it was changed. But the point there was that Donald Trump had been leading every single day of the 2024 election cycle. CNN made a note that in the entirety of the 2024 year, Joe Biden led 0 days of the 2024 cycle. I mean, he was never ahead of Donald Trump on head-to-head national polls, and that mattered. In battleground states, Joe Biden was losing every single battleground state with very limited exceptions. He was ahead in Pennsylvania briefly, ahead in Wisconsin briefly, ahead in Michigan briefly, and while certainly there could have been a circumstance where, had that debate gone very differently, that Joe Biden would still be in the race today, that Joe Biden would still be in a position where he could win the presidential election, but that's not where we are today. And the aftermath of that debate was not only Joe Biden losing, but losing even worse. And that's why my election prediction after the first presidential debate, the only presidential debate that Joe Biden participated in, because again, he's no longer the nominee, had him at just 226 electoral votes, the worst Democratic performance in the 21st century. And so he was not in a good position after that debate. North Carolina was certainly far, far, far out of reach here. And now the Trump campaign absolutely is cognizant that North Carolina could very well flip this election cycle. And the reason for that is because they know that Kamala Harris has a unique strength in a way that even Joe Biden did not back in 2020, to inspire and mobilize the Democratic base. When you take a look at why people were voting for Joe Biden back in 2020, a huge part of that movement was the, quote, settle for Biden movement. There was a lot of Democrats who were enthusiastic and excited about the prospect of a new Democratic presidency. But for the majority of voters that were voting for Joe Biden, as what exit polls showed and the election polls leading up to the election in the final few weeks, was that they were voting against Donald Trump, against Donald Trump's COVID handling, against Donald Trump and his response to the Black Lives Matter protests, against Donald Trump and what his administration had done for the 4 years prior. It was all anti-Trump, 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 anti-Trump. And the last time Democrats actually had someone who, in theory, was largely for somebody, for a candidate, inspired by a candidate, was Obama in 2008 and Obama in 2012. And that had been a long time up until 2020, and in 2024, it just simply wasn't happening again until Joe Biden dropped out of the race and shook everything up. And so that's why North Carolina is largely back in play too, because the Trump team really didn't invest in the state. Democrats had the ground game already laid out for Joe Biden. It wasn't a winning strategy because at the end of the day, the vibes were on the side of the former president, the enthusiasm was on the side of the former president, the turnout numbers that we were expecting were on the side of the former president. But now the Democrats have all these campaign field offices in North Carolina and have the ad infrastructure and the Democratic Party infrastructure that had been set up from the 2016 election, 2018 election, 2020, 2022, so on and so forth. The Democratic Party, while not the favorites to win North Carolina by any standard, are certainly in a far better position to win the state. I would have given Joe Biden maybe a 5 to 10% chance of winning North Carolina. I think those odds have certainly risen to around 30, 40, potentially even 50%, depending on some of the data that we might see released over the next coming weeks. And that's good news for Kamala Harris, because it means Republicans are now needing to invest in the state. The Trump campaign announced last week that they are now opening up ads in North Carolina for the first time this cycle. Democrats have been spending money on North Carolina. They've said they were going to spend tens of millions on North Carolina, had already bought ad reservations. Republicans had $0. Again, why? Because the Trump team very much felt like North Carolina in no circumstance between now and November was going to become competitive. And the Democrats were just going to spend endless dollars on a state that they were simply not going to win. But now they acknowledge that Kamala Harris has, in fact, tied this battleground state. Now they acknowledge that Kamala Harris has, in fact, come to a point where this state is becoming far more beneficial for the Democratic Party and far higher in terms of likelihood of victory for the Democratic Party than at any point this election cycle, and potentially even better than where it was back in 2020. I'm so excited to see new data out of the state beyond YouGov, which is an A-rated pollster, but I'm excited to see even more data. What we know about North Carolina right now is that Kamala Harris, while may not be in a position where she is winning the state of North Carolina, she's certainly in a far better position than Joe Biden, and that's where you want to be. Because in 2020, Joe Biden only lost the state by 1.3%. And by inspiring turnout in the same way Obama did in 2008, driving out the support in the suburban areas the same way Obama did in 2008, is the exact way that you can win a state like North Carolina, the exact way that Kamala Harris can win the presidency, not only through the Rust Belt, but through a Sun Belt strategy that includes not ignores, but includes North Carolina in a way that hasn't been considered, hasn't been possible, hasn't been discussed this election cycle because of the constraints of the Biden campaign that have now been entirely unburdened by Vice President Harris's candidacy. And North Carolina being in play means a lot more money on the table in that state, a lot more rallies in that state, a lot more polls in that state, and a new focus on that 7th battleground state that Republicans had been hoping for months on end would never see the light of day as a true battleground state is now in a very real possibility of going to Kamala Harris. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.